All right, good morning. It's good to be back with you this morning. Yesterday morning we worked out of the book of Philippians. This morning we're going to work out of the book of 1 Peter. So, give you a head start to find it there. How many of you have traveled to a foreign country? Where have you traveled? What's that? Okay, Nicaragua, all right. What? Poland, okay. Burma? You've been to Idaho? We are a foreign country, but have you been there? That's good. Idaho is distinct even sometimes in connection with the United States. But here's what I noticed. My wife and I arrived 1 a.m. on Friday night, Saturday morning, and so we slept in the hotel. And then Saturday, Sunday, and a little bit on Monday, we did some sightseeing around the island here. And what struck us is there are obvious differences between Prince Edward Island and Idaho, but not massive, right? Like, we could still communicate. You guys speak a version of English, right? And we could communicate, and we could order food and all of that. It wasn't radically different. You drive on the correct side of the road, and so we didn't have that issue. We could read the street signs. You have roundabouts, traffic circles. We love them. I wish they would put more in Idaho. They only have a few, and I prefer them because they keep traffic flowing rather than trying to control traffic with lights. But Boise prefers lights over roundabouts, and I'm trying to convince them that you guys know the way, all right? So it wasn't radically different. We could maneuver. About a decade ago, we were in Australia. And Australia is similar still, right? They speak a version of English, and they have roundabouts. But they drive on the wrong side of the road, and that can get confusing. And there are other differences, things that can, strike you. So it was similar, but even more different than you all. In '99, we were in Auckland, New Zealand, which, by the way, traveling to Auckland, New Zealand with a 4-month-old and a 3-year-old, by the time we landed in the Auckland airport, we had been in airplanes or airports for 21 straight hours with a 4-month-old and 3-year-old. So that was an adventure. And when we were in New Zealand, again, similar to Australia, not radically different. Certain things, like my wife got chewed out at a restaurant for asking for a napkin. The waitress informed her, "You're not in America, honey. It's New Zealand. We don't call them napkins. They're serviettes." She was pretty snarky about it. It's like, okay, we got to make sure we don't use the word napkin when we're asking for a napkin. We're asking for a serviette. And there were other things, like I discovered in New Zealand that the battery on your car doesn't die, it goes flat. Tires die. That's backwards. Because in the United States, tires go flat and batteries die. And so there were some differences. But when I was in Haiti in 2011, landing in Port-au-Prince and driving through Port-au-Prince up to the mission station where it's going to be doing some teaching. Now that was different. I'm not sure what side of the road they drive on in Haiti. They just drive wherever they feel like driving. And they honk and move, and and if you want to cross the street, you just walk. It doesn't matter if there's 20 cars coming at you. And everyone's supposed to slam on their brakes. Driving was a complete adventure in Haiti. Obviously, the language was different, and so I'm teaching, and I have a translator who's translating it from English into French. But then there's people in the audience who don't even speak French, and so their neighbor's translating it from French to Creole, and we're trying to make sure the message gets across. The food they eat was very different, and they wanted to honor me as an American. So at lunchtime, at our little lunch breaks for the teaching times, they broke out a bag of white bread and some cold cuts, and figured I would want a sandwich. When what I really wanted to eat was the beans and rice and chicken that the Haitians were eating. So I asked, could I just join them? Because the food was very different. They didn't think I would like it, but it was actually quite good. Haiti was radically different. just the physical environment was different. You'd look at a power pole, and that's definitely not going to pass a safety inspection. Like there's like 200 wires all coming in and hanging loose into that power pole, and it's like that's a mess. The way they interact with each other is different, very different than the United States. When you travel, particularly to places that are radically different from your own country, when you travel overseas, you notice their way of life is different. One of the things that struck me in Haiti was there weren't trash cans anywhere. The trash can was just the ground, and trash was everywhere. I've even noticed a little bit around here that there's not as many trash cans as we have in the United States, even here. We have trash cans everywhere because we're so apparently afraid of anybody littering that we're going to make it super convenient wherever you go. You're going to make sure there's a trash can within 15 feet. When you travel overseas, you notice cultural differences. And the longer you're in a place overseas where the cultural differences are dramatic or extreme, you begin to feel a little bit out of place, right? It's like, man, I kind of wish, I kind of miss. Wouldn't it be nice if, I noticed that even in the United States, like just regionally, because the United States is so big. When we lived in Ohio, my wife and I both had grown up in the Pacific Northwest, and then we moved to Ohio for graduate school. I called Pizza Hut and tried to order a pizza. In Idaho, you can order a pizza with Canadian bacon and pineapple. That's a kind of pizza. I tried to order that in Cincinnati, and they didn't know what in the world I was talking about. So the first time we ordered it, what it showed up with was regular old bacon, chopped into fine pieces, sprinkled on our pizza, and then pineapple and some other things. I discovered after living there for a few months, what you have to do to get a Canadian bacon and pineapple pizza in Cincinnati is you have to order a Hawaiian pizza and minus about 7 or 8 other items on it. Then you get what you want. Oh, that makes sense, right? In Cincinnati, I'm working at a hardware store. Someone comes in and asks me a question, and I replied. And then they said back to me, please. And I'm like, that response makes no sense in the context of this little conversation we just had. Because in Cincinnati, please means, excuse me, I didn't understand what you said. But I didn't know that. It took me a while to learn that. Cincinnati, when they make chili, they put it over spaghetti noodles. That's what chili is. If you want what everyone else calls chili, you have to say Texas-style chili. And even then, it's a bad version of it. Which, by the way, we had some chili for lunch yesterday with a few people, and it was actually good chili. So I was impressed that Canadians, at least some of them, can make good chili. You notice differences even like in companies. Have you ever worked for one company, changed jobs to a new company, similar field but different company, and the way the company operates is different, right? They function differently because they have different values or different priorities. I don't know all the coffee shops in Canada and around here. I was just talking about Tim Hortons. Apparently, that's a big coffee shop around here. We don't have Tim Hortons in Idaho, by the way, so if you come to Idaho, you'll be sad. But we do have Starbucks, and you have that, and we have what's called Dutch Brothers. Dutch Brothers was started in Oregon, and it's kind of made its way around the Pacific Northwest, and they're mostly drive-up coffee shops, no seating inside. And Dutch Brothers has a completely different vibe and completely different approach to Starbucks. And you have to order differently at Dutch Brothers than you do at Starbucks. The language is different. And Dutch Brothers appeals to all the young folk. My son worked there when he was a teenager, and they play loud music at their drive-up, and they have this real kind of energetic, high-end, peppy sort of vibe, and they're super friendly. They're leaning out there, the order window almost into your car, right in your face. And that's the way they operate. And they have a whole thing called the Dutch Creed, and it's all about joy and happiness and fun and all of that. And that's going to be their vibe at their coffee shop. So if you worked at Starbucks and then you go to Dutch Brothers, it's going to be very different. If you worked at Dutch Brothers, you're probably not going to want to to work at Starbucks because it's not nearly as much fun. It's way more corporate and way more controlling, right? Like different regions, different companies, different countries have vastly different cultures. And you, if you move from one to the other, might feel out of place. Here's the reason I bring all that up this morning, is visiting a foreign land or living in a foreign land can make you feel out of place. 1 Peter highlights, in fact, 1 Peter in a lot of ways emphasizes the out-of-placeness of being a citizen of heaven here on earth. And so as we continue to develop this theme about who we are and how then we can honor Jesus based on who we are, we need to wrestle with this sense of out-of-placeness that maybe we feel at times as Christians in our own country. And 1 Peter has some insights and some wisdom for us on that theme. And so that's why I want to focus on 1 Peter this morning. And so what I want to do real quick is I just want to walk through a handful of passages in 1 Peter so you can hear how Peter talks to us as followers of Jesus about this sense of out-of-placeness. I want you to hear the language he uses, and then what I want to do is I want to develop sort of the background to 1 Peter and the background to Peter's language to help us understand why we feel this out of place and how we should respond to it, all right? So let's read a couple passages from 1 Peter, picking up in the very first verse. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, he opens his letter this way. Peter, an apostle of Christ Jesus, to those who reside, and we'll look at a map in a second of all these places, but notice this word, to those who reside as strangers. Strangers. That word is the idea of somebody who's out of place. Somebody, in some regards, who's a foreigner. That's the idea. They're like a temporary resident. They're somebody who's living in a foreign land. This translation has called it strangers, meaning you're a foreigner in a strange land. That's the idea. To those, and he's writing to Christians who are living as strangers scattered throughout, and he lists off all these places that make up modern-day Turkey, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who are chosen. Notice that, too. They're chosen because they're God's chosen people, but they're living in their own kind of country as foreigners, outsiders, strangers. Next one. 1 Peter 1:17, if you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves, that word is like carry out your life, right? Carry out your whole life in fear, like in reverent fear of God, wanting to honor God during the time of your stay. Or some translations will say, during the days of your sojourn. There are some translations that actually add a phrase after this that I think confuses the point. They'll add during the time of your stay on earth. That's not in the original, and I think it misses the point. The reason it misses the point is we're always going to be on earth. There's going to be a new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells, and we're going to be resurrected, and we're going to have a new body, and we're going to live on a new earth for all eternity. It's not during the time of your stay on earth. It's during the time of your sojourn in this world where you feel like an outsider, where you don't fit in and you don't belong. You're a stranger in a foreign land. So during the time of your sojourn. Next one is chapter 2, verse 11. Beloved, I urge you, and then he pairs together two words that have a similar meaning. They overlap. Foreigners and strangers. The first one emphasizes more the idea of like you're an exile. It's the word that would be used in the Old Testament if they were translating the Hebrew into Greek for an exile. You're an exile. So foreigners, exiles, and strangers, outsiders. I urge you to abstain from fleshly lust, to abstain from fleshly desires, which wage war against your soul. And then the last one, 1 Peter 5:13, right at the end of the letter, as he's signing off the letter, look what he says. She who is in Babylon. Wait a second. We're writing this during the New Testament. Babylon doesn't exist anymore. The country is gone by this point. Why does Peter say Babylon? It's code word. Because what was Babylon in the Old Testament? What was the place Israel went into? Exile. It's where they had to live in exile. So it's a code word. She, that is the church who's in exile, who's in Babylon, who's living in a foreign country as outsiders where there's oppression and where they feel like they're in exile. She who's in Babylon, chosen, again, this emphasis of being chosen as God's people, but outsiders in the world, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. And that's how he signs off the letter. And so as you read through 1 Peter, this theme of being strangers, outsiders, exiles, foreigners, living in a foreign country, it shows up scattered throughout this letter. And so why is that? Well, to understand that, we've got to understand a little of the history behind the letter. What's the backstory to 1 Peter? And so 1 Peter is written to all these people he mentioned in verse 1 that are living in all these places. I think we have a map again. So here's modern-day Turkey, but these are the regions where they're at that 1 Peter is written to. Asia, Bithynia and Pontus up there on the north, Galatia through the middle, Cappadocia over on the eastern edge. 1 Peter's written to these people, Christians, living in these kind of regions. So a bunch of different churches through geographical regions in different cities, Peter's writing to them. And it's about the year 65 AD, about 35 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And the church has now spread all the way from Jerusalem and Israel throughout this whole region and even beyond by this point in time. And what's happening is Nero is the Roman emperor, and hostility towards the Christian is increasing. And it hasn't ramped up to the point of like full-scale executions and all of that quite yet. More what they're experiencing is social dislocation and marginalization because of their faith in Jesus. In other words, they're looked at as odd. They're looked at as weird. And the reason for that is because the whole culture was kind of just hardwired with and embedded with all sorts of paganism and a whole host of different values that were contrary to the way of Christ and the Christian way. So, do we have any plumbers in the room? Not a single plumber. Any electricians? Not an electrician. All right, because we're all like preachers, pastors, and we don't have real jobs, right? If you're living in Galatia or Bithynia and Pontus at this time period, and you were a plumber or an electrician, you had some trade, whatever it was. Maybe you were a stonemason. Maybe you were a metal worker. Maybe you worked on the city plumbing and the pipes underneath the city. Whatever it was, then you effectively were almost required to belong to a trade guild to practice your business, to do your job. And the trade guilds provided support and encouragement. They were sort of like cross-pollination. Like you might be a particular metal worker who's good at this, but Bob over here is a particular metal worker who's good at this. And so someone comes to you and says, can you do this? He's like, Bob would be better at that. And so instead of being cutthroat capitalism, you would work together in your trade guild. And your trade guild also provided like support for your family. Do you have a medical emergency? Well, there wasn't insurance, but you would pay dues to your trade guild, and your family have a medical emergency. The trade guild will help take care of your family. That's the way it worked. But every trade guild had a patron god or goddess. And so if you were going to go to the trade guild meeting on Thursday night, they would do a little incense ceremony and sing a little hymn to whatever their patron god or goddess was in order to honor the God who watched over their trade guild. But you've become a believer in Jesus. So how do you go to the metal workers trade guild and their monthly meeting and pay their dues and honor Jesus while at the same time singing a hymn to maybe Zeus or Hermes or somebody else? You can't do that. But if you don't participate in the trade guild, then you're going to be shunned, banished, and you can't really practice your business. That causes problems financially for you and your family. And now you're struggling. And what do we do, right? And they all just think you're dumb and weird anyhow for worshiping this guy that was crucified on a cross by one of the Roman governors. Not only that, you no longer go to the after-hours meeting with guys from the trade guild where there was food and women of the evening to provide a little bit of entertainment and recreation for you that evening. That was common and customary. And now that you follow this crucified guy, you don't do that. Well, that's really weird. Why wouldn't you do that? Everyone does that. Everyone has a wife to bear legitimate children and has prostitutes and concerts to exercise the body for a little bit of pleasure and fun. Everyone does that. And you won't? You're weird, right? This is what's going on with the Christians Peter's writing to. Their beliefs put them at odds with the way culture works because you're effectively you're an atheist. You don't believe in the gods. And your ethics put you at odds with culture because you won't just do what everyone else does to enjoy life and to get along and to make life bearable in this hard world. You have weird ethics, right? And as a result, the hostility, the mocking, the rejection, the being kicked out of the trade guilds, all that stuff is ramping up in 65 AD, and the Christians are dealing with it. They're being treated as odd, weird. They're not able to practice their business. Finances are hard. They've been rejected by friends and family, and in a highly collective culture where your life depends on family and friends, and now you don't have that, life has gotten really difficult. And Peter's writing to them to help them understand, look, you're chosen by God even if you're outsiders in the world. Here's how you need to respond to that. That's what he's dealing with. That's the backstory to this letter that forces Peter to use this language of strangers, foreigners, exiles, people who are living in Galatia, but it's like being in exile in Babylon, people who are, you grew up in Bithynia, but now you feel like a foreigner in your own hometown. Like you feel out of place and life doesn't work right. That's the situation that lies behind this, and that's what Peter is addressing. And Peter speaks to them very clearly as these people who are like, well, you grew up here, but you don't really know how to live here anymore. I often think of like missionaries who moved to a foreign country and now they're living abroad. And I have some former students and friends who just recently moved. They can't even really tell us the actual place they moved for the safety of their team and themselves and for the people they're working with. But they've moved to a place in North Africa, and the pictures I've seen is like, well, that's not like Emmett, Idaho anymore. You're living in a small little house with a grass hut, and you're sitting on a metal bucket that's upside down on a small little brick bench trying to type on your computer. And your electricity comes and goes, and your computer may not work every day because you ran out of power and its battery died, right? And the people you're working with, and you're in this circle complex, and your house is one room, and you're in this circle complex where you got the clay, dirt, and that's kind of where life happens, and all these huts are around them. That's not like Emmett, Idaho anymore, right? And people do different things, they eat different foods, they have different practices, and you feel very much that culture shock of being out of place. You're living in a foreign country. Well, for the early Christians that Peter's writing to, and really all the early Christians, that was their perspective and their experience. We're like foreigners in a strange land. Now that we are citizens of heaven and we're following this Messiah named Jesus, we're outsiders, even if we're living in the same town we grew up in. That was their experience, and Peter's trying to help them realize, and that's understandable. That's kind of normal because you are citizens of heaven living on earth, and so you're foreigners and strangers. And that was their experience and their perspective, and it needs to be ours. And for a long time, I don't know so much about you all. I assume it's similar to our experience in the States. For a long time, it did not seem that way. It didn't feel that way. Yes, obviously, there were differences. Christians had some different values than the dominant culture around us. But there was we could assume a fairly large overlap, right? Like, kind of generally speaking, American values and Christian values overlapped to a large degree. There was a time when, you could kind of assume some of that. And that, in some ways, that assumption confused us into almost linking our national identity with our Christianity. Right? People even use the phrase that, like, America's like a Christian country, we would say, right? And we just assumed, by and large, that everyone sort of thought the same way. We could even assume for a long time in the United States that people kind of had at least a basic understanding of the Bible. You could reference the story of David and Goliath, and people kind of knew what you were talking about. You could even reference some things from other biblical stories, and people knew what you were talking about. Not so much anymore. They don't know the Bible. They don't have those assumptions, and they certainly don't hold those values. Let me just give you a few examples from my country. I don't know exactly what it's like in your country, but in our country, human resources, that department of the corporation, right, that enforces kind of code and policy for the business, you're working in a company, and now you're compelled by human resources to use words and language that you know contradict reality, but if you don't do them, you're going to get fired. Or if you uphold Jesus' views on marriage and sexuality, then that makes you looked on with suspicion and maybe even be labeled as hateful. Young parents in the United States have to now be vigilant even on kids' TV shows because of the sexual identity propaganda that shows up in kids' TV shows, and they certainly have to be vigilant with what's going on in their kids' schools, because kids as young as 5 are being taught you can choose whatever gender you want to be. And if you want to identify as a cat, you can do that too. And so parents of young children are having to be extra vigilant because of the gender identity propaganda that's going on in our culture and our society. If people discover that you're a Christian, like a genuine follower of Jesus, there's a good chance in the United States you might be labeled as a greedy, racist capitalist because you're a Christian. Some of that's because Christians have acted that way. Some of that's because of just being viewed with suspicion and misunderstanding. The reality is, in the United States, maybe so here, it's no longer that people are just unchristian. Increasingly, people are anti-Christian. Have you experienced that? Felt that some? And the reality is, we feel a bit more out of place. We see things and we hear things, and there's policies being passed and there's issues being debated, and we're like, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like, what happened, man? Like, where everything changed. Like, the world is now very different, and it makes us as followers of Jesus feel like, wow, I'm not even sure what to make of some of this. I'm not even sure how to address some of this. What happened? Has the world gone crazy? And we feel a little bit out of place. I'm not alone in this, am I? There's that old kind of little Christian song that this world's not my home, I'm just a passing through. Did you guys sing that here in Canada? Yeah? The song's not quite theologically correct. It does get some things wrong, right? Because we are going to live on a new heavens and a new earth for all eternity, right? But this country's not my home anymore. I'm just passing through, right? That's the reality that song should be getting at for us. This country certainly, and you're not going to like rewind time and go back in time. Highly unlikely. We are living in a time and place where if you're going to put X marks the spot, you are here. Where we are increasingly at as followers of Jesus is we're foreigners and exiles in our own country. We don't belong here. We don't fit in. There's ideas, beliefs, values, practices, things that other people just take for granted and make perfect sense to them that we're like, that's just completely contrary to everything that makes sense to me, right? But to them, they're looking at our beliefs, our ethics, our practices like, You guys are a problem. And we're viewed with suspicion, distrust, hostility. Why is that? It's because what Peter writes in 1 Peter. We're beginning to experience what the original audience of 1 Peter was experiencing. We're beginning to experience feeling like outsiders in our own homeland. So how do you live as an outsider, as a foreigner? How do you live in exile, right? That's the idea Peter's wrestling with. How do you live in exile? Well, Peter has some advice for us on that. How do you do that? And Peter's advice is deeply formed and shaped by his own experience as a Jew and his people's experience of literal exile in Babylon. And so Peter is going to give advice to us, but to hear his advice in the full context in which Peter thinks about it, means that we have to understand a little bit about the Jewish experience, right? And so if you know your Old Testament, Israel eventually split into north and south. They sort of had a United States experience, right? Let's divide into two countries, a north and a south. The northern country in the Old Testament was deemed Israel. The southern country is usually referred to as Judah in the Old Testament. Israel was taken by Assyria in 722 BC. The southern country remained for a century longer and was eventually taken captive by Babylon and led away into exile by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian armies. First deportation, 606, and then several others. And so they go in to Babylon as exiles. And so now you have this group of Jews living in Babylon, and they're living in a pagan country that worships all sorts of false gods, doesn't have their values, doesn't have their beliefs. They are very much foreigners where they are living. And they're outsiders both religiously and ethically and by virtue of worldview. Everything is different for them. And for those who want to be faithful to God, now you're raising kids in Babylon, but you want them to know about Yahweh and God's covenant with Israel and the stories of God, and you have this tension. How do I raise godly kids in a foreign country? How do I honor Yahweh in a pagan land, in exile? Israel experienced this deeply, profoundly, and literally during the Babylonian exile. So the prophet Jeremiah, at God's instigation, has some advice for them and writes them a letter. And so Jeremiah, who's not in Babylon yet, sends a letter to the exiles who are in Babylon. And in that letter, he writes these words. This is from Jeremiah chapter 29, part of this letter that Jeremiah writes. He writes this. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile. Notice that. God takes responsibility for sending them into exile because of their breaking of the covenant. No time to get into that. But who I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's God's advice. Here's his instructions. Here's what I want you to do. You're living there. You're going to be there for a while. So build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. The reason God tells them that is because you're not coming home anytime soon. So you might as well make yourself comfortable. Build some houses, plant gardens, settle down, live there, take wives, father sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and daughters. Notice now we're into grandkids. You're going to be there a while, Israel. You're going to have grandkids there. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands so that they may give birth to sons and daughters and grow in numbers there and do not decrease. And then here's the part I want us to pay attention to. Seek the prosperity of the city. The Hebrew word for prosperity there is shalom. Seek the shalom of the city. Seek the welfare and the well-being and the peace and the goodness of the city. You're exiles living in this foreign land. Here's what I want you to do. Seek the good of the city. Be good citizens. Help your neighbors. Do good things for them. Try to make life better for those pagans there in Babylon. Settle down, have kids, seek the shalom and the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray for them. Pray that the Lord's going to bless them. Pray that the Lord will help them. Do good for them and pray for them, for in its peace, in its shalom, in its well-being is your well-being. If you make the city better, that's good for you too. That's his advice. Settle down, do good, be good neighbors, be a good part of the community, do good, and pray for their well-being. Now, the reason we had to read that is because of what Peter's going to say to the original readers and to us when he writes to them. He's writing to people who, they might be living in the city they grew up in, but because of their newfound faith in Jesus, it's like they're in exile. It's like they're living in a foreign country. And all their neighbors that they've known from childhood, they worship all those foreign pagan gods, and they have weird and different sexual ethics from people who follow Jesus, and they have different belief systems and different values, and they have different career goals from those who follow Jesus. So now they feel like foreigners and exiles in their own country. So here's what Peter says. How do you live in exile? How do you live in exile? Peter writes this, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Here's his advice. Beloved, I urge you, as foreigners and strangers, to abstain from fleshly desires, which wage war against the soul, which wage war against what's good for human flourishing. And then he says this, keep your behavior. That word behavior is a word that means your whole manner of life, not just specific acts, but the whole way you organize your whole life, the whole way you carry out your life, the whole way you plan your life, go about your life, what you do, what you choose, your aims, your ambitions. Keep your whole manner of life excellent among the pagans, among the unbelievers, among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, those guys, how could you possibly believe that? That's so stupid to believe that. You think that you shouldn't do. Your ethics are weird, and they slander you as evildoers. You're hateful. You're unkind. You're unloving. They slander you as evildoers, but you keep your behavior excellent, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, your helpful, benevolent, useful, good deeds, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God on the day he visits us. What is Peter's advice to us about how to live in exile? His advice is, just like in Jeremiah 29, be good neighbors. Be good citizens. Do good for your community. Find all the way you can to serve them, so that in the thing in which they slander you, they may be like, man, I don't get why they believe what they believe. And some of their ethics just seem, they don't make any sense. But man, they sure are nice people. They sure are helpful. I know I can trust them. So we, by our behavior, cause them to doubt their disbelief in Jesus. Our behavior creates some dissonance in the way they think, and they're like, man, I don't know why they believe in Jesus, and I don't know why they do some of the things they do, but they're some of the best neighbors I've ever had, and it makes me wonder about, I don't get it. That's how you live in exile. You're foreigners and strangers. You abstain from the fleshly lusts, worldly desires, worldly passions. You keep your behavior excellent. You do good. In fact, Peter actually coins a word, it seems, a little bit later coming out of this passage in the paragraphs that follow, where he takes the word for good and the word for do, he puts them together, and Christians are supposed to be do-gooders. Not in the pejorative sense where, we're putting people down because you're such a do-gooder, but in the sense that you're just known as people who do good in town. You do good in the neighborhood. You do good for people. That's how we live in exile. We be like some of the best neighbors and the best community members. We help the most amount of people we can, individually and corporately as our churches, so that we develop this reputation for people who you're really good for the community. I don't get why you believe what you believe, and I think it's weird that you don't support X agenda or you're against this, but man, you're really good neighbors and really good members of the community. That's how you live in exile. Peter learned it from Jeremiah 29, and Peter's passing it on to us. That's really our calling, is to be that. Now, when you read the following paragraphs after verse 12, when Peter says, abstain from fleshly lusts, do good, what would you expect be the first thing he says? It'd be easy for us to start thinking about immoral things, right? Like, oh yeah, abstain from fleshly lusts. We want to abstain from anything that's, any sexual sin, anything that's perverse, anything that's dirty and unclean. We want to avoid that. That's what we might assume. That's not the first place Peter goes. The first place Peter goes after this is honor the governing authorities. It's the very first thing he says. Honor the governing authorities and do good, he says. And then he says to household servants, because that was very common, right? It would be roughly equivalent to, not exactly equivalent, but to employees. You're working for somebody else. You're a household servant. Guess what? You just work hard. You be a good household member. You do what you're asked. You go above and beyond. You be the most trustworthy household servants you can. Be a great employee. Work hard. Be somebody they can count on. They know they can trust you. You're good for the company. Do that. He says, then he speaks to husbands and wives, and he says, now, wives, if your husband's not yet a believer, guess what? You just be such a godly, loving, hardworking, good spouse that you might win them over even without a word, because there's like, my wife has changed. She's different. Anyone ever hear of Lee Strobel? Wrote the book Case for Christ. That's exactly how he came to faith in Jesus. His wife became a follower of Jesus, and he was an atheist journalist in Chicago. And as he watched his wife, he's like, she is not the same person she was before, and I like her better now. Maybe there's something to this church stuff. So he started going to church, and he became a follower. And look at the ministry that's come out of that for him, right? This is Peter's advice. You do good in your community. How do you live as foreigners and exiles? You do good. Here's the way the Apostle Paul puts it. The Apostle Paul puts it this way in the book of Romans chapter 12, verse 21. He says, do not be overcome by evil. Don't be overcome by all the evil, all the bad stuff, all the frustrating, angry-making stuff in your society. Don't be overcome by that. Instead, overcome evil with good. That's how you live in exile. That's how you live as foreigners and outsiders. In fact, that sentence, verse 21, overcome evil with good, that's the climactic sentence to a long description Paul gives in Romans 12 about how we're supposed to live in exile. I want to read you the whole description. I'm not going to put it on the screen. I just want you to listen to this long description, because overcome evil with good, well, there's a lot of details leading up to that he gives. So listen to what he says. Love must be free of hypocrisy. Detest what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. Don't lag behind in diligence. Be fervent in the Spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Persevere in difficulty. Be devoted to prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. That is, contribute to the needs of God's people. Take care of each other. Provide for each other. Don't let there be a needy person among you. Practice hospitality. Welcome one another into your homes. Open your homes. Bless those who persecute you. When people are mean to you and hard to you because of your faith in Jesus and because they make life difficult for you, bless them. Speak well about them. Do good to them. Bless and don't curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another. Don't be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Don't be wise in your own estimation. Never repay evil for evil to anyone. Someone's mean to you, don't be mean back, right? Someone says ill about you, don't say ill back. Don't post nasty things on Facebook or Instagram or anything else, right? Respect what is right and good in the sight of all people. If possible, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. Work as hard as you can, even with that neighbor who doesn't like you and who makes life difficult. Do everything you can to be a good neighbor and live at peace with them. Don't take your own revenge. Leave room for the wrath of God. He'll take care of it. He'll sort out everything, right? And he'll be the one to fix all wrongs and make everything right. You don't have to be the one to do that. That's God's job anyhow. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. If your enemy is hungry, what should you do? Feed him. If he's thirsty, what should you do? Give him something to drink, because in doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Then he says, don't be overcome by evil. Overcome evil with good. That's how we live in a country where we increasingly feel out of place as God's people. Man, the world seems to have gone crazy. It doesn't feel like my home anymore. I don't feel like I fit in. They believe things that I can't believe they believe. They think things I can't believe they think. They practice things I think, man, that is just immoral and evil, and I don't understand it. And you think that's good and wise and normal, and I don't get it. And when I speak up about it, you look at me like I'm the problem. Well, guess what? That's the way the world is going. We've had a kind of several hundred-year vacation from where most Christians have actually lived as outsiders and as living in difficulty because of the hostility. I think vacation is over for countries like the United States and Canada. Vacation is over, and we're back to being outsiders again. And that's okay, because guess what? When we were outsiders in the first century, we changed the world. And we did it by doing good, by living in town, being good neighbors, good community members, by blessing our neighbors. When we were at our best, this is what we've done. You read about the early Christians. They were the only people in the ancient world who cared for widows and orphans, and they were looked at as weird for doing it. We just assume compassion and caring for needy people is normal. Why? Because Christianity has influenced Western culture. But it used to be, you're weird for taking care of poverty-stricken poor people and orphans. The early church took a stance against adultery, abortion, and infanticide, and they were viewed as odd for doing so. Why would you rescue somebody else's baby that was set out to die out in the woods? Because that was completely common in the Roman Empire, and the Christians became known for finding those babies in the woods, taking them in their own home, and raising them as their own, and they were viewed as weird for doing so. They did good, and they changed the world. They actually practiced humility, and that was viewed as a vice by Roman culture. Why would you lower yourself to serve other people? That's upside down, stupid, and dumb. But by doing so and serving others, they changed the world. When we've been at our best, we have done good in society. One historian writes this. He says, when someone started to deride the early church as being made up of immoral traitors and cannibals, a growing sea of voices began to rise in protest. Actually, that's not been our experience of them. We've experienced them as people of rare kindness and compassion. In fact, I'm starting to wonder if loving the God they speak of might actually be a good idea. That's how the early church changed the world, by being different in a good sort of way. They did good. And so all the propaganda that was against them, all the stuff that was shouted against them by the powers that be, their neighbors were like, well, I hear you say that, but they're the best neighbor I've ever had. They're the kindest person I've ever met. So I hear what you say about them, and yeah, I'm not so sure about what they believe, but what you're saying is not true. Because I've experienced them as helpful, benevolent, kind, compassionate, good, a good person. And the reality is, when we're at our best even today, it's still been the same way. 70%, for example, of health care in Malawi is provided by facilities belonging to churches. 50% of Papua New Guinea's health services come from churches and church-related organizations. Evangelical Christians are 5 times as likely than the average adult to adopt children. The need for clean water around the world is great, and Christians are at the forefront of providing clean water in rural communities throughout the world. In 1 year, World Vision provided hand-washing facilities at over 14,000 schools and at 15,000 healthcare facilities, and more than 9.4 million households gained access to clean water from Christian organizations from 2020 to 2022. When we're at our best, we're doing good, and we're serving the world. You can find all sorts of stats along this way. Interestingly enough, even today, 6 out of 10 poverty activists grew up in a Christian household, even if they're not currently a Christian. Why? Because that's a Christian value. They're stealing our job. They're doing our work, whether they realize it or not. David Kinnaman, the president of the Barna organization, says the crucial question the next generation is asking is not whether the claims of Christianity are true, but does Christianity account for good in people's lives? That's how we live in exile. We do good. So what would it look like if your church in your town was known for the good it did in the town? What would it look like? It's a church I was a part of 20 years ago, and that became our story. We were in a small little town called Kuna, Idaho. And sometimes in a small town, you can almost have a bigger impact. So we decided to do good. We were near the prison, so we had a lot of single moms whose husbands were incarcerated. We had a lot of kids and families where it was hard to even just buy school supplies. So every year, we would set up in the city park, and we'd do a school supplies drive. We would get the classroom list for each of the grades, and we would provide school supplies for kids. And we would have a line of 200, 300 parents coming to get school supplies for their kids. We started working with the school district, and we started providing basically Christmas for families that couldn't afford it. And we would have gifts for the ages and for the kids. We'd get information from the school, and they could come and shop for free. And we had gift wrapping station, and we would provide gifts for families that way, where they could pick out gifts for their kids because they might not get them otherwise at Christmas. We started providing meals for families around Thanksgiving. We started providing oil changes. We had several mechanics in the church, so we started providing oil changes 3 times a year for single moms and the elderly who might not be able to afford them. And here's what happened as a result of that. We would do a vacation Bible school every year in the city park, outside in the park, and provide meals with that. We were supposed to pay over $500 a week to reserve the park. But the mayor said, you guys do so much good in town, we're not going to charge you. We were known for doing good. Then, when the mayor's marriage fell apart, he wasn't a believer. When his marriage fell apart after 25 years, he shows up in the church office, pouring out his story and bawling to the pastors. Why? Because we did good in town, and he figured he could trust us with his heart and his story. Right? When we're at our best as Christians, that's how we live in exile. We're known as people in town who, you do so much good in town. That's Peter's advice to us. That's the call for us. We are foreigners and exiles and outsiders. Let's be known, not for what we're against, but for how much good we actually do in town. Let's pray. God, give us wisdom, prayerful wisdom, to see the needs in our communities, and then figure out how could we, as your people, meet those needs in Jesus' name, so that maybe in the thing in which our current culture slanders us, we could show them a better way, a different way, and maybe just cause them to come to faith in you so that they can glorify you on the day in which you return. So give us grace, give us wisdom, and give us strength to be known for the good we do in town. In Jesus' name, amen.